Possibility of a war between Iran and Israel casts a long shadow over the Middle East. Tensions between the two nations have simmered for decades, fueled by a complex web of geopolitical rivalries, ideological clashes, and security concerns. Iran's nuclear ambitions have been a particular flashpoint, with Israel viewing a nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat. Proxy conflicts, cyber attacks, and military posturing have further inflamed tensions, creating a powder keg in one of the world's most volatile regions. The consequences of a full-blown conflict between Iran and Israel would be devastating, not only for the two countries directly involved, but also for the wider region and the world. The Middle East, already grappling with multiple crises and conflicts, would be plunged into further turmoil. The global economy, heavily reliant on the stability of the region's oil production, would experience severe shocks, and the international community would face the daunting challenge of containing a conflict with the potential to escalate into a wider conflagration. The risks are undeniable, but so too is the need to avert such a catastrophic scenario. Diplomacy, dialogue, and a commitment to de-escalation are essential to prevent the current tensions from spiraling out of control. The international community must work together to address the underlying issues fueling the conflict and to create the conditions for a more peaceful and stable future. The alternative is too dire to contemplate. Opening salvos, military and political ramifications in the region. A war between Iran and Israel would likely begin with a series of calculated strikes. Israel, possessing a technologically advanced military, would aim to cripple Iran's nuclear facilities and military infrastructure. Iran, in turn, would retaliate with ballistic missile attacks on Israeli cities and military bases. The conflict would quickly engulf the region, drawing in neighboring countries and non-state actors. Hezbollah, Iran's proxy militia in Lebanon, would open a second front against Israel, launching rocket attacks and engaging in cross-border raids. Other militant groups, such as Hamas in Gaza, could also be drawn into the conflict, further expanding the scope of the fighting. The political ramifications of such a conflict would be equally profound. The Middle East's already fragile political order would be shattered, exacerbating existing divisions and potentially leading to the collapse of governments. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict would be further inflamed, dimming any remaining hopes for a negotiated settlement. The region would be plunged into a state of chaos and instability with no clear end in sight. Global power play reactions from Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. The outbreak of war between Iran and Israel would immediately draw the attention of global powers, each with their own interests and alliances at stake. The United States, a staunch ally of Israel, would face immense pressure to intervene militarily, potentially triggering a wider conflict. Russia, with its own strategic interests in the region and ties to Iran, would find itself in a delicate position, seeking to maintain its influence without being drawn into a direct confrontation with the US. China, a rising global power with growing economic interests in the Middle East, would be forced to navigate a complex geopolitical landscape, seeking to protect its investments while avoiding entanglement in a major conflict. The responses of these global powers would be crucial in determining the trajectory of the conflict. A united front condemning the violence and calling for a ceasefire could help to contain the fighting and prevent further escalation. However, divisions among the major powers would make it more difficult to find a diplomatic solution, increasing the risk of a prolonged and wider conflict. The international community would face a critical test, requiring diplomacy, restraint, and a shared commitment to peace. Section 4. Economic shockwaves, oil prices, and global market volatility. The global economy would be profoundly affected by a war between Iran and Israel. The Middle East is a critical supplier of oil, accounting for a significant portion of global production. The conflict would disrupt oil supplies, sending prices skyrocketing and creating economic shockwaves worldwide. Businesses would face higher energy costs, consumers would feel the pinch at the pump, and governments would grapple with inflation and economic instability. The interconnectedness of the global economy means that the impact would be felt far beyond the Middle East. Financial markets would react with panic, experiencing volatility and uncertainty. Global trade would be disrupted as supply chains are disrupted and businesses face uncertainty. The conflict would exacerbate existing economic challenges such as inflation and supply chain bottlenecks, further slowing global growth. Section 5. A human rights catastrophe, displacement, suffering, and humanitarian crisis. Beyond the geopolitical and economic consequences, a war between Iran and Israel would unleash a humanitarian catastrophe of immense proportions. The fighting would result in widespread death and injury, displacing millions of people and creating a refugee crisis of unprecedented scale. Civilians would bear the brunt of the suffering, caught in the crossfire, losing their homes and facing shortages of food, water, and medical care. The international community would face the daunting task of providing humanitarian assistance in the midst of a conflict zone. Aid organizations would struggle to reach those in need, hampered by the fighting, logistical challenges, and a lack of funding. The refugee crisis would strain the resources of neighboring countries, potentially destabilizing already fragile regions. The human toll of the conflict would be immeasurable, leaving a legacy of trauma and suffering for generations to come.